On July 22, 2003, two of the most feared men in Iraq, Qusay and Uday Hussein, found themselves cornered by U.S. forces. The brothers, once thought to be untouchable, now had nowhere to hide. What followed was a brutal, violent standoff that would end in the shocking deaths of both men. This is the untold story of their final hours, a tale of betrayal, desperation, and ultimate retribution. Stay with us as we uncover the gripping truth behind the last moments of the Hussein brothers' lives. Qusay and Uday Hussein, the sons of Iraq's infamous dictator, Saddam Hussein, were products of a regime built on fear, oppression, and violence. As Saddam's sons, they were given immense power, control, and privilege. But their roles in Iraq were defined by cruelty and corruption, and both brothers played pivotal roles in maintaining the iron grip their father held over the country. Uday, the older brother, was notorious for his violent and erratic behavior. He controlled the Iraqi military and state-run media, using his power to intimidate both the public and political elites. His role as the leader of the Fedayeen Saddam, a paramilitary group loyal to his father, meant he had the means to enforce Saddam's will on the streets. He earned a reputation for torturing those who displeased him, including government officials, ordinary citizens, and even athletes who failed to meet his expectations. His brutality was legendary, and he became a symbol of Saddam's unrelenting regime. Qusay, the younger of the two, was considered by many to be the more ruthless and calculated of the two. Despite being overshadowed by Uday's public display of power, Qusay wielded immense influence behind the scenes. He was Saddam's heir apparent, trusted with overseeing Iraq's military operations and security apparatus. He ran the Republican Guard, the elite force that protected Saddam and helped maintain his oppressive rule. His reign was marked by suppressing dissent and eliminating rivals within Saddam's inner circle, ensuring his father's rule remained unchallenged. As they grew older, both brothers became increasingly paranoid. They were aware of the ever-present threat to their power. Enemies inside and outside of Iraq plotted against them, and the Hussein family knew that their downfall could come at any moment. But they had confidence in their positions, believing they were untouchable. That confidence would ultimately lead to their desperate final hours, when the empire they helped build began to collapse. From their rise to power to the violent, ruthless rule they both led, the world had no idea that their time was running out. But the end game was near, and it would come in a way no one expected. As the U.S. military invaded Iraq in 2003, the country's fragile political system was dealt a fatal blow. Saddam Hussein's once imposing regime crumbled almost overnight, and the Hussein family was forced to face the consequences of their oppressive rule. For Qusay and Uday Hussein, the collapse of their father's power marked a new and terrifying chapter, one filled with chaos, uncertainty, and the looming specter of capture. When Baghdad fell to U.S. forces in April 2003, Saddam was nowhere to be found, and the city was left in chaos. But Qusay and Uday's fates were not yet sealed. Unlike their father, who had gone into hiding, the brothers clung to the hope that they could escape the fallout and reassert control over the country. Their connections within Iraq's military and intelligence apparatus gave them the belief that they could continue to wield power, even if Saddam was no longer in control. But as the U.S. and its allies made progress on the ground, it became clear that the Hussein family was on the run. The U.S. military launched a nationwide manhunt for Saddam, Qusay, and Uday, the three men who had terrorized Iraq for decades. But the brothers were not ready to give up without a fight. Qusay, who had been groomed to succeed Saddam as leader of Iraq, took charge of the military operations in the southern parts of Iraq, while Uday continued to control the regime's remaining media and communications. The brothers relied on loyal security forces and tribal allies to keep them hidden. But as the pressure mounted, their options began to dwindle. The Iraqi population, wearied from years of war, began to turn against them. And even former allies grew hesitant in the face of mounting international pressure. The Hussein brothers were becoming more isolated. U.S. forces closed in on their locations, and their network of support began to falter. As the walls closed in, Qusay and Uday knew their time was running out. The only question was whether they would be captured alive, or if they would choose to fight to the death. But despite the walls closing in, the brothers refused to give up. Would the U.S. forces be able to track them down before they disappeared into the shadows once again? Or would the Hussein legacy end in a violent, bloody confrontation? As the U.S. forces intensified their search for the Hussein brothers, Qusay and Uday retreated further into the vast, chaotic landscape of Iraq. The once mighty sons of Saddam Hussein were now reduced to fugitives, hunted by the world's most powerful military. Their final refuge was in the northern city of Mosul, a place where they hoped they could disappear and evade capture, at least for a while longer. Mosul, with its mix of urban sprawl and rural outlying areas, offered both cover and vulnerability. The city was a stronghold for Saddam loyalists, and for a time it appeared to be the perfect place for the brothers to lay low. Qusay and Uday found shelter in a fortified house provided by loyalists who still believed in Saddam's cause. The brothers moved between various hideouts, constantly on edge, relying on loyal security personnel and tribal alliances to keep them hidden. But Mosul was also a place of growing uncertainty. The Hussein brothers' paranoia mounted as rumors spread about their locations. They knew that the U.S. military was relentless and that betrayal was always a looming threat. Their isolation in the city grew more acute as loyalists abandoned them, realizing that the game was over. The brothers, once symbols of power and control, were now desperate and vulnerable. With every passing day, the walls began to close in. U.S. intelligence services had gathered valuable information from interrogated captives, and they were closing in on the brothers' position. The reconnaissance drones that flew overhead were a constant reminder of how little control the brothers had over their fate. Yet they still held on to the belief that they could escape, perhaps cross the border into Syria or Iran, or hide in the desert where the U.S. forces wouldn't be able to find them. But by the time the U.S. military had gathered enough intelligence, it was already too late. The brothers had become cornered in their last stronghold. The tension was unbearable. The brothers knew they had little time left. Would they escape once again, or would the hunt finally come to an end? U.S. forces were closing in, but Qusay and Uday had one final chance to escape, or make their last stand. The final days of Qusay and Uday Hussein were marked by escalating tension and desperation. While the brothers believed they could outlast their pursuers, U.S. intelligence had other plans. Over the course of several weeks, the U.S. military gathered key intelligence that would ultimately pinpoint the exact location of the Hussein brothers' hideout in Mosul. The walls were closing in. Their time was running out. In the days leading up to the raid, U.S. forces had received critical information from an informant who revealed the location of the brothers' fortified hideout. It was a secure, high-walled house in a relatively quiet part of Mosul. But the Hussein brothers, having become experts at evading capture, were still convinced they could escape once again. The location of the safe house was not just a hiding place, it was their last chance to avoid the inevitable. The operation was already in motion, and the planning had been meticulous. The 101st Airborne Division, along with Special Forces units, were set to strike. Delta Force soldiers had been briefed and were ready to storm the house. The objective was clear: capture the Hussein brothers alive, if possible, but if necessary, use force to neutralize them. For weeks, U.S. intelligence had been tracking the movements of Saddam's remaining loyalists, and now they were certain that Qusay and Uday were within striking distance. On July 22, 2003, the raid began. U.S. forces surrounded the house at dawn, moving in swiftly and quietly. The plan was to secure the perimeter and isolate the brothers from any potential escape routes. But there was no subtlety to what happened next. Qusay and Uday were not going to be captured easily. They had prepared for this moment, knowing that their last stand was near. As U.S. forces approached, the brothers opened fire. The battle that ensued was intense. The brothers, surrounded by a handful of loyal bodyguards, fought desperately to defend themselves. The house became a war zone, filled with gunfire, explosions, and the deafening sound of battle. Despite their defiance, the brothers were no match for the overwhelming military force closing in on them. The brothers' last act of resistance was not enough. U.S. forces had breached the house, and the final showdown had begun. Would Qusay and Uday manage to escape once again, or was this their last stand? The end was near, and no one knew it better than they did.
The operation was a carefully planned strike, but it quickly escalated into a violent firefight. U.S. Special Forces and soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division took up positions outside, but Qusay and Uday's loyalists were not willing to give up without a battle. They knew this was their last chance to resist the overwhelming force that had cornered them. Grenades and small arms fire erupted from the house, targeting U.S. forces as they tried to move in. The fighting was intense. Explosions shook the compound as heavy artillery rained down on the structure. U.S. helicopters provided air support, their guns strafing the perimeter and ensuring that any escape routes were closed. The brothers' bodyguards, armed with AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades, fired from windows and doorways, desperately trying to protect the Hussein brothers. Inside, the walls reverberated with the sound of bullets ricocheting, the impact of grenades, and the constant shouting as both sides fought for control. The U.S. soldiers were trained for these kinds of operations, but they were still in danger. Qusay and Uday, though trapped and outnumbered, showed no sign of backing down. They were fighting for their lives, knowing that this might be their last chance to escape. After hours of fighting, the situation inside the house was decimated. Both sides had suffered casualties. The house was in ruins, the walls riddled with bullets and shrapnel. U.S. forces had made it clear that there would be no surrender, only capture or death. But despite their resistance, it was becoming clear the brothers were losing this battle. Uday, who had once been known for his erratic violence, was now wounded and unable to continue the fight. Qusay, the more strategic of the two, was trying to orchestrate a final escape, but his options were limited. Their final hideout had been compromised. The compound was surrounded on all sides, and there was no way out. In a last-ditch effort, the brothers tried to fight back, but their ammunition was running low, and the constant bombardment from U.S. forces made it impossible to escape. As the Special Forces closed in, a grueling firefight erupted inside the compound. Qusay and Uday, surrounded by their loyal bodyguards, managed to hold their ground for a brief moment, but they were overwhelmed by the superior firepower and tactics of the U.S. military. Their loyalists were outnumbered and outgunned, and it was clear the battle was lost. Eventually, Qusay and Uday were captured alive. Uday, severely injured and unable to resist, was taken first. Qusay, although still in relatively better health, was quickly subdued as well. The once feared brothers who had ruled Iraq with violence and terror were now prisoners. Their defiant last stand had failed, and the end had come swiftly. The two brothers were quickly transported out of the compound. They had been defeated, but there was still a question of what would happen next. What would the world do with the two men who had been symbols of Saddam Hussein's regime for so long?
Though they were captured, the ultimate fate of Qusay and Uday was still unclear. Would they face justice, or would they meet a different end at the hands of those they had wronged? The tension was thick, and the world was waiting for the final decision. After Qusay and Uday Hussein were captured by U.S. forces, their brutal fate was far from over. The military operation was swift, but what followed in the aftermath would shock the world. The Hussein brothers were no longer the feared figures that had ruled Iraq for years. They were now a spectacle for the public eye, a chilling reminder of the terror they had once inflicted. Rather than receiving a formal trial, the bodies of the brothers were paraded for all to see. The humiliation of their capture was amplified by the public display of their lifeless bodies. For many Iraqis, the brutal deaths of Qusay and Uday marked the end of an oppressive era, and they were treated as symbols of justice. But not everyone agreed with how the aftermath was handled. In the immediate aftermath of their capture, the bodies of Qusay and Uday were taken to Baghdad for identification. U.S. officials confirmed their identities using dental records and DNA tests. But the bodies were then subjected to a shocking public display in Misrata, a city that had suffered greatly under the Hussein regime. The once feared brothers were laid out for all to see, with people from across the country coming to witness the fall of the Hussein dynasty. Rebel forces and everyday citizens, some who had endured years of brutal repression, gathered in large numbers to gawk at the bodies. While some Iraqis saw this as a moment of retribution and justice, for others it represented a violation of dignity. The bodies of Qusay and Uday were not treated with the respect one might expect for fallen leaders, but as trophies, a gruesome end to a regime built on violence and terror. The controversial display lasted for 3 days, during which time hundreds of Iraqis lined up to view the bodies. Some took photographs and videos, while others stood in silence, reflecting on the bloodshed that had gripped their nation for decades. The brothers, who had been the face of the brutal Hussein regime, were now reduced to little more than flesh and bones, a horrific reminder of the decades of tyranny they had inflicted. Despite the rejoicing from those who had suffered under the Hussein family, the entire process sparked a deep moral debate. Was this kind of display a just end, or was it barbaric? The world was watching, and the aftermath of the brothers' deaths would leave an indelible mark on the collective memory of Iraq and the world. The display of their bodies raised more questions than answers. While some saw it as justice, others saw it as a dark omen of how deeply the scars of the Hussein regime ran. What happened next would change the course of Iraq's future forever. But what would be the ultimate fate of their legacy? After the controversial public display of their bodies, the final chapter of Qusay and Uday Hussein's lives was yet to be written. While Iraq began to grapple with the end of a brutal era, the question of their burial loomed large. The fact that their remains had been shown to the public stirred anger, divided opinions, and left many wondering, how should the sons of Saddam Hussein be laid to rest? The National Transitional Council, NTC, now in control of Iraq, had to make an urgent decision about the brothers' burial. Despite the overwhelming hatred for the brothers and their infamous legacy, the process of laying them to rest became a political minefield. Some believed that their graves should be kept secret to prevent them from becoming symbols of martyrdom, while others argued that a more humane and respectful burial should be carried out in order to move on from the violence of the past. Ultimately, the decision was made to bury them in a remote desert location in western Iraq. Their final resting place was kept a closely guarded secret, with only a handful of individuals knowing the exact coordinates of the grave. This secrecy fueled speculation and conspiracy theories. Some believed that the Hussein family had arranged the burial, hoping to give the brothers a kind of final dignity, while others felt it was a symbolic closure, a way to prevent further glorification of the two men who had wreaked havoc on the nation. In the days following their burial, there were mixed emotions in Iraq. For many, their deaths were the ultimate justice. The brothers, who had been responsible for countless atrocities, including brutal torture, mass executions, and the suppression of millions, were finally punished. Others, however, felt that the lack of a trial and the unceremonious burial denied Iraq the closure it truly needed. Their fate had been sealed by the chaos of war, not by a legal system, and it left many asking, could the regime's brutal legacy ever truly be erased? Meanwhile, the political aftermath of the brothers' deaths proved to be just as turbulent as their rule. With the Hussein family's downfall, the country was left in disarray, struggling to rebuild amidst sectarian violence, rising insurgencies, and the fragile political landscape that had emerged in the wake of Saddam's capture and execution. The Hussein brothers were buried in secrecy, but their legacy still looms large. Would Iraq ever truly recover from the trauma of their reign, or was the cycle of violence and revenge far from over? The road ahead for Iraq would be long, and its future uncertain.
The deaths of Qusay and Uday Hussein were felt far beyond the borders of Iraq. Their capture and subsequent violent end were a symbolic victory for many who had endured the brutal reign of Saddam Hussein and his sons. But the global reaction to their deaths was mixed, with many questioning the fairness of their end, especially given that they had never been formally tried for their crimes. In the United States and the West, the death of Qusay and Uday was seen as an end to the Hussein family's reign of terror. For years, the brothers had been responsible for numerous atrocities, including torture, war crimes, and repression of political dissidents. Their violent methods of maintaining power had earned them international infamy, and their deaths were perceived by many as a form of just retribution. However, the lack of a formal trial meant that many were left with lingering questions. While the capture of the brothers brought a sense of closure for Iraqis who had suffered under their rule, the absence of justice through a trial made their deaths feel like an unfinished chapter in Iraq's troubled history. Some wondered whether their deaths would mark the true end of the Hussein dynasty, or if the family's influence would continue to haunt the region in one form or another. Meanwhile, the Middle East had its own reactions. In some countries, particularly in the Arab world, the deaths of Qusay and Uday were seen through the lens of Western interference. The role of NATO and U.S. forces in bringing about their capture and subsequent deaths raised questions about the nature of foreign intervention and the extent to which it should be involved in internal conflicts. Some viewed the brothers' violent end as proof of the West's desire to assert control over the region, while others saw it as a necessary step in dismantling a brutal regime. In Iraq, the legacy of the Hussein brothers was still fresh in the minds of many. While their deaths may have marked the end of the Hussein family's direct control in Iraq, the country's political struggles were far from over. Sectarian violence, terrorism, and the rise of extremist groups like ISIS would plague Iraq for years to come, and many questioned whether the Hussein brothers' deaths truly brought justice or merely sowed the seeds for another round of bloodshed. The global reaction to Qusay and Uday's deaths left many questions unanswered. Had the cycle of violence truly ended, or were the roots of chaos still deeply embedded in Iraq's future? The world was about to learn that the consequences of the Hussein brothers' reign would reach far beyond their violent deaths. The deaths of Qusay and Uday Hussein brought an end to the direct power of the Hussein family in Iraq, but their legacy remained a dark shadow over the country. Despite their brutal rule and the violence they inflicted on the Iraqi people, their final moments and the aftermath of their deaths highlighted the complexities of justice, revenge, and the quest for closure in a nation torn apart by years of oppression. For many Iraqis, the violent deaths of the brothers symbolized the ultimate retribution. After decades of fear and control, their humiliation and demise were seen as a victory for the Iraqi people. But the celebrations were short-lived. The collapse of the Hussein family left a vacuum that was soon filled by sectarian violence, insurgencies, and the rise of extremist groups. While the brothers' deaths marked the end of a regime, it did not bring the peace and stability that Iraq so desperately needed. The legacy of Qusay and Uday's rule still lingers in the memories of those who lived under their tyranny. The fear they instilled in the population, the torture and repression they used to maintain power, and the countless lives they destroyed are still felt by many in Iraq today. Even with their deaths, the country struggled to move forward as the scars of their reign remained. Internationally, the deaths of the Hussein brothers also raised uncomfortable questions about the role of foreign intervention in shaping the fate of nations. While the West celebrated the fall of one of the most brutal regimes in modern history, the aftermath of the Iraq War exposed the dangers of nation-building and the long-term consequences of military intervention in a complex, volatile region. The world's attention may have turned away from Iraq after the fall of the Hussein regime, but the country's struggles have continued, with the effects of Qusay and Uday's rule still deeply felt. The political, social, and economic challenges that Iraq faces today are in many ways a direct result of the legacy left behind by the Hussein family. Qusay and Uday Hussein may have been brought to justice, but their legacy still haunts Iraq. With the country left in turmoil, the question remains, can Iraq ever truly recover from the years of violence, or is it doomed to continue the cycle of bloodshed and chaos?